I'm Donna Sharp from MediaLink, a strategic advisory firm that has had the great pleasure of working with hundreds of executives in global marketing over the past 12 months. And I'm here today with my colleague, ANDREA REDNISS, who has been a transformative leader in terms of brand and marketing transformation in partnership with many of these brands, to share with you some of the forces that have been driving this change, and most importantly, how we believe you as leading marketers can unlock the opportunity in your organizations. I'm going to hand it over to ANDREA, who will start talking us through what exactly are each of those marketers that we're working with facing today.
Thank you. So as we're really looking at sort of what we're seeing in the overall ecosystem today, we're really seeing that pressure is mounting on businesses, from many different angles, internally as well as externally. And we're really seeing that with that change is coming this enormous opportunity for brands. There's this sustained change in business into the digital space from consumers, the way they're interacting and how they're leveraging the digital space, and as well as from brands and how they are marketing their customers and having these conversations and selling their products and how their products are evolving in that space. With all of this increased digitalization is, of course, coming more measurability and more opportunities to measure these results and really focus more on that performance. As we really look at sort of the echo that we're seeing after the pandemic, we're seeing that, last year there was, brands really struggled in many different areas, as in sort of, the whole world. But this year they had to perform, which meant that there was an uber focus on accountability going into this year. And what we're really seeing now is that they're flourishing and it's giving light to a whole new way of measuring and doing marketing, really in this more accountable type of a way. So we really look at sort of how these business models are changing. We've been talking about, how consumers are becoming more digital, there's more e-commerce shopping. So, but what is the reality? Is that, are they staying there after, after the pandemic, and now that things in many areas have gone back to somewhat of a quasi-normal? And as you can see from this chart here, that really in every global major market, that the move to e-commerce is here to stay, that it is actually, it's increased across the baseline, across every single country. So when we're looking at really systemic changes here. And with those, brands are really investing in sort of new models as they are looking at how their consumers and their entire, ecosystem is shifting. And with this is really coming, some real fundamental infrastructure shifts, and looking at really how this is going to impact their paid media, as well as how they're really creating these commerce-enabled interactions with their customers through all of their touch points with their consumers, and specifically when they're looking at their media. When we look at some of these marketing models that are actually being impacted by this, and really this shift to really look at some of these short-term and long-term results, we're really seeing that there's some of these lagging models, which is really what we saw in the past, which is more historically around that sort of one-to-many communication. It was more brand focused, more self-centered. And now then we started to see it evolve more into this data-driven marketing and speaking to the right customers at the right time. And now really what we're seeing is this third level of innovation, which is really getting into what we're calling brand formats, which is where brands have to prove that they can perform and while still at the same time driving brand, which is really what we've seen happen in 2021 here, which has been, they need to drive their brand messaging while at the same time driving sort of those lower funnel metrics to show that they are performing. And this is where we're starting to see a lot of those metrics come into play. So we're seeing many brands, whether they take this from something, in like the fintech space, more around like brand and purpose, to really lead those types of specialties. We're looking at some of the tech companies that are really focusing on sort of growth and look at product and sales. When we look at something even like, Mars just announced that they changed all of their brand marketing titles to growth and demand titles. And we're seeing things like this wave of mass personalization when we're looking at sort of customer-centric marketing around creative data and analytics for brands like Amazon, Starbucks, Walgreens, and how that's really driving their marketing and really bringing together that brand messaging and performance at the same time. And then we're also seeing that brands are looking to insource is a piece of this as well, specifically for competitive advantages around sort of cost and speed. And Lego is a great example that's really taking advantage of that as well. So as we kind of dive a little deeper into this, there's really these new business realities that really combine sort of these requirements and these updates across these new measurements, these new models and new tools. There's really the strategic decisions, really looking at sort of like the identity and the impact drivers. There's sort of that idea that we're now looking at more daily optimizations, and not only across these performance campaigns, which is what we're used to seeing them across, but also we're really looking across these branding campaigns as well. I'm looking at some of these insights-driven marketing, really to drive, this business that we're looking at here. Interestingly, the ANA released a white paper, recently here, and when we looked at the KPIs that would come out of that most brands are looking at, we saw that most of them were actually focused on these sort of vanity metrics rather than more of these business-driving metrics. And while we believe that there's really a place for both, what we're really seeing is that it's really important to tie them together and make sure that when they're looking at this, that that those brand metrics and those vanity metrics are tied to how they actually drive the business KPIs. Because in the end, what we'll say is that it's all about the brand driving KPIs, right now. As we look at sort of these marketing budgets, they've really increased dramatically. And when we look at that, what we're seeing is that's really causing a significant number of fall-on effects because of that. So one, the marketplace has come back dramatically. We know there's a dearth of talent because of that, but really a lot of this is driven by this increased spend and the fact that there's an increased spend in these very specific areas, specifically around digital and showing performance. And the talent that's needed around that has actually changed dramatically. And so as you can see here, the budgets have gone up, and we expect them to continue to go up. I know, a year ago we were saying, that 2021 was going to recover, but maybe not back to the 2019 levels. You can see we've actually surpassed that, and it's planned to even continue on even further as we move into the end of the year and the beginning of next year, which has really caused a dramatic shift in the overall marketplace.
So with the changes that come from having more accountability to these measurable results, really looking at a variety of metrics and this growth in spend, how are brands' priorities shifting, and what does that look like on a micro level when we look at the negotiations, most recently, for instance, here in the US during the upfronts? Well, we looked at a comparison of a survey that was done both in 2019 and in 2020 that covered all of the major spenders and all 6 of the primary holding companies in terms of what were truly the decision trees, the priorities against which folks were making their decisions around which networks and how much was going to be spent. Now, what we've seen is that all of these changes are driving a shift in what we prioritize. What we prioritize as marketers and where we place our dollars. This is also coming into a year where there is significantly more dollars in the market. So as Andrea mentioned, that means a lot more pressure and competition. So as each of you have been, going to spend larger commitments than ever before, looking to drive your brand and your performance. That's why we're seeing a huge increase in the preference of flexibility into terms, even in some cases, deprioritizing pure scale numbers, which in the past had been typically the number one driver of decisions in terms of spending. Not shockingly, with the shift to digital commerce also has been a shift to digital in general. Cross-screen capabilities and true connected cross-screen capabilities, or the ability to control for frequency and then measure results, leaped up in terms of the priorities and during negotiations. And therefore, some of the asks of the past around, can I have a specific platform or a network integration or added value kind of bumpers and logo placement were shot to the bottom in terms of what was going to be meaningful. So there's a lot of both quantitative metrics that are changing in terms of how advertisers and their agencies are going into the marketplace, but there's also a number of equally important intangibles. And so we looked not only at the priorities from a negotiation standpoint and how am I evaluating packages, but also how consumers have been driving more accountability in terms of how marketers are spending their dollars, how you're spending, and also how you're portraying the markets that you represent. And we've seen that with the rapid change and much more of a spotlight put in the past year on how brands are standing up and speaking and taking actions in terms of social justice, in terms of representing racial equality, that this has been an added pressure that needs to be balanced with increased measurable results, with the need to drive your brand and also be accountable to consumers in terms of what you stand for. There are still a lot of questions that remain in terms of how an advertiser with their media investments in particular can be more inclusive. And so as we have helped a number of advertisers in terms of evaluating where are the places and spaces that you can put your dollars, how can you think about both the existing Black, Hispanic, or diverse owned media companies around the world? How are you also thinking about investing in the future of content creation? And that's why you're seeing lots of different approaches and a lot of creativity in terms of how can we increase these investments, how can we proactively support and grow. But there isn't really a united front. And that's why you've seen, ranges of 2% commitments to 5% commitments to 10% commitments. And really the question is, how much is enough? That each marketer is going to need to make the decision about both your consumer set, what this means to your audiences and the markets that you play in, and how you can also make up for lost time in many cases in terms of growing the capabilities. So as we take into account all of these different pressures that have been mounting over time, as I mentioned at the start, we see this as a huge area of opportunity for growth and opportunity for change. If our workflow in the past 9 to 12 months has been any indication, MediaLink has never been busier working with marketers of all shapes and sizes on their transformation of really needing to address how do you understand the resources that you have within your organization and where you need incremental or dramatic change. Talking about speed and how do we move at the pace of change that our consumers and the marketplace is moving. A lot of marketers are talking about agility, but very few actually operate in an agile way in which the majority of the technology community speaks. And then lastly, how do we think about our tools, our technology, even our just day-to-day communications, and enable transparency through an organization or through our partnerships to help support the fact that we are building more resources and we are operating at such a high speed. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the examples and how we've actually addressed this that you might be able to take back to your own organizations and think about the opportunity for change. So first up is really thinking about how to have an eyes open review of the ecosystem in which you work today. We've helped many marketers in terms of a discovery process to review, does their current structure support the way the business has changed? For many of you, whether you are a manufactured good or a retailer, the shopping behavior has changed, the experiences have changed, your products have changed. And as a result, having a fresh eyes look at both your structure in terms of supporting the business, but then also in terms of supporting the consumer experience has been an important exercise for many of the marketers that are meeting this change and driving growth. The second really has been a focus around process. So in addition to how your teams are structured and the type of talent that you may have, how are you enabling people to truly set clear roles and responsibilities, to have clarified races that allow them to know where it's important to collaborate or where people can move and act at speed. Technology and infrastructure continues to be an important area of focus in terms of what type of capabilities I have internally I need to lease. We know there has been a significant amount of change or predicted change and then paused change in terms of the way the ecosystem is going to operate from a cookie standpoint and a privacy standpoint. But all of that means that you still, as a major marketer, in order to operate against more personalized messages, in order to operate with more measurable results, need to have an infrastructure that works for you. Capability assessments, both internally and externally, have been a major focus because in reality, even with the most powerful teams, the requirements have changed. The requirements have changed significantly in the past year. And as Andrea shared, we don't see any of these returning to 2019 normals. And so oftentimes when we're looking at capabilities, we think about it from a talent perspective, a skill sets perspective, and then break down what are the opportunities for each organization to grow your existing skill set. So championing some of your internal strengths and being able to expand that, where you're going to require learning and development. So no one here is in the business of needing completely new hires, getting massive incremental FTE approvals. You really do need to look at the talent that you have today and how you can upskill and grow them. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there's no hiring to be done. We recently worked with a marketer who said, I'm very happy for our organization to be a teaching hospital, but I need to make sure that I have some surgeons on board first. And that's an incredible way to think about how you surgically decide the need for new and outside skill sets, in particular with many of the retail businesses we're working with, or those that are products that are now product and service companies. How do you bring people in from outside potentially of your current vertical, but how do you help and champion them to be able to grow the rest of your workforce? And then lastly, being really honest about the opportunities to outsource and where you're not going to be able to upskill or grow at the rapid speed that you need. And so where are those opportunities to really look for expert specialists or partners outside? And so as you'll see, we like to do this both at a team level, a skill set level, and then down to individual talents, which is something that as you think about working with your HR counterparts and the team leaders across your group, is a good time. I think many people have just come out of mid-year reviews to say, what are the skill sets that we're going to need for the future, and how do we help grow that within our teams, and where do we need to bring from the outside in? But as I mentioned, it's not just about the people and having the right skill sets and the structures. It's also the process that you put around these people to help really enable speed. And so many of you work for massive organizations, which means there are lots of people, lots of hands for things to pass from one to the other. And so it's important to understand when many marketers talk about agility, truly the focus on agility is going to be a combination of efforts. How are you truly allowing for your organization to have accountability and responsibility at a level in which small groups or individuals can move at speed? For them to be able to have the right level of information accessible to them and to know the guardrails and the rules and what are foregone conclusions in terms of what needs to happen and where their gut needs to come intact. But in addition, one of the most important roles that you have as a leader of your organization is offering the flexibility for prioritization and reprioritization. This is where most of our experience in coming to analyze companies in terms of their process gaps comes into play, is when there is not true executive leadership that allows for reprioritization. As Andrea mentioned, with the increased spend, there's also a vast increase in initiatives, both the number of campaigns you're running and the number of internal initiatives in terms of, we're working on a mass personalization project or a digital transformation project or an education program. And as a result of that, you as the leader need to help your teams and the individuals who are made to be accountable within an agile structure to be able to set and reset priorities. And that also means deprioritizing. We think this is oftentimes one of the biggest gaps between making an agile or just a faster process work, is many people say, well, they've told us to work fast and they've told us to work at speed, but really it just means do more things at once, and we now have permission to change our minds all the time. That's not the type of agile process in which you want to work. And a lot of this, as I mentioned, is both, yes, the tone that you set at a leadership level, but also the infrastructure and the operating model that you have to support this type of work.
So with all of that, what we're really seeing is brands are really looking to invest quite heavily in their overall data and technology to really transform these ways that they're actually working. There's been a movement for many years now to sort of harness that first party data, but as we're starting to see, a lot of the laws and regulations change, we're seeing that there's more and more of a push to say, how can we leverage that first party data and make sure that that's really what's driving our marketing? So with that, we're starting to see that brands are bringing things in-house. They're trying to get much closer to true ROI with their marketing investments and the initiatives that they're actually doing. So very specifically around things like their MMM and their direct connections between sort of this internal as well as the agency pipelines, that we're seeing that they're pulling a lot of these pieces in-house so that they can infiltrate across all of the different elements of the marketing that they're actually doing, and they can have a true ROI there, and that can really empower the cross-functional team. So whether that's across the marketing intelligence, we're looking at sort of the data activation and sort of how they're fusing these pieces together. When they're looking at their external partners, we really see, similar to what a lot of you guys are probably looking at, is the fact that look at what can they bring to the table? Where can we actually get a competitive advantage, with this data? How can they help activate and unlock this, for the brand? We talked about this whole brand performance plan, and the only way that brand performance really works is if you're able to take that really rich data and infuse that across everything that you're trying to do, so that you can really flow seamlessly throughout this whole consumer lifetime and consumer journey here. Because as we know, we talked about the funnel collapsing and all of this, but it's really about making sure that it's about the customer focused data and really focusing more on what the customer needs rather than what the brand needs to be pushing out. And so with that, it really comes this very specific data. And we're seeing things like within the model that brands are building out these teams, oftentimes offshore, but at the same time still considered to be internal, to really influence their marketing on a regular basis and looking at ROI across all of their marketing and their complete marketing funnel. So when we look at that in the tech stack that's actually behind all this, this is not, the cookie-based, paid media stack that we were looking at before. This is really a stack that's built on trust and transparency, really to unlock this automation. Is what we're seeing is that when we're looking at these relationships that brands are having with their agencies, they're looking at how can we move this beyond just purely these FTE models, and how can we actually have a more strategic partnership here. And a lot of that comes from the agencies being able to help them automate these pieces so that they can move faster and they can be replicated. A lot of these things can actually be automated, but the catch here is that there has to be trust and transparency with the data. So, and what we mean by trust is that everyone and all the stakeholders actually buy into it. We've actually all seen a number of models where brands have sort of moved a little too fast. The technology has kind of gotten ahead of sort of the reality, meaning that they're able to automate these pieces of, of the marketing platform, or the, even say, very technical, like a media planning. However, if all of the stakeholders don't believe in the data inputs that are going into it, and they don't believe that those are the best metrics, and there's still some question about the data, we find that in the end, these models actually fall flat, they get overridden, and it ends up being an automated model that runs in the background, and it's just a redundant process to where the humans end up coming back in and overriding it. So one of the first things that we end up spending a lot of time with brands talking about is, what are those metrics that we can all trust, and how do we actually put those together in a very transparent type of a model? Everybody talks about speed and flexibility and those being the key drivers today, which they absolutely are. But it's trust and transparency that actually enable the speed and flexibility, because you can only move as fast as the data inputs that you actually have to allow you to make those very informed decisions as you move forward. And so as we really look at sort of how you can bring this to life now, and sort of what is these opportunities you can really embrace, the first thing we really see is really creating this ruthless prioritization of sort of these backlogged processes. And what we mean by that is the marketing world is changing very, very quickly today. And what we see oftentimes when we get called in to work with brands, is because we see that they have a number of these legacy projects that were, and by legacy, I mean, maybe they were kicked off, 9 months, 12 months ago. But the fact is the world has changed so dramatically, and it continues to change. We find that reevaluating what it is, where your priorities are on a very regular cadence is extremely important, and making sure that you have just that ruthless prioritization and focus on the consumer and the business outcomes, to make sure that you're always focusing, in the right specific areas with the marketing efforts that you've got going on. And a lot of those internal initiatives, even around building out infrastructure and things like that. When we're looking at sort of data, it's really about not hoarding the data. It's about making sure that it's obviously within the compliant ways, that it's being shared and leveraged appropriately, and that you're unlocking ways for it to be able to be shared. So unlocking the way the data was collected, what it means, where are the potential pitfalls with that data, so you can really build that trust, and the organization can actually make decisions on that, so you can have the opportunity to move at the speed of business today, and really keep that going, and put in this significant automation, which is really going to be the competitive advantage of the future. It's going to be, when we start to look at how speed wins, automation wins when it comes to speed. So in order to put automation in, obviously there's got to be transparency and trust around that data, which requires transparency. And then really looking at realistically, what are the talent pieces here? I think Donna said it best, when the idea is that most organizations, they're all right being a teaching hospital, but we have to be very specific about where is it that we need to hire those lead surgeons, to actually lead that training. And so we're looking at that is about being realistic about the talent assessments, and then putting in a very rigorous L&D plan to make sure that you're really focusing on that learning and development for the core talent there, especially because we're seeing that staffing is one of the most challenging pieces that we're all facing in today's marketing reality. And so we want to make sure that we can keep that at the highest level in order to make everything, because that's of course the backbone of what makes everything hum and work here.
So thank you for spending some time with us today. We hope that we were able to enlighten on some of the opportunity areas with the amazing brands that we've been able to touch in the last year. We know that there are a lot of areas of opportunity across the marketing ecosystem, and the change is only coming faster. So if you have any questions or you'd like to talk more, please feel free to reach out. We're looking forward to our next conversation with you.